Yes, okay. Well, dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to open this very important Zoom meeting, and it's one that I come to the table, I guess, feeling very, very overwhelmed in some ways by the enormity of the events that have transpired to bring us to the position we're in today. This is an event hosted by the Tom Uren Memorial Fund and by ICAN, and of course we're celebrating today the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. You know, this has been an idea, a dream of so many people for so many years, and it's absolutely extraordinary that we've finally reached the point of the treaty coming into force. Let me say something just very briefly, I'm sure others will perhaps touch on this, about Tom Uren and the fund that we've created in his memory. You know, it's difficult in some ways on a personal level to say a lot today because it's approaching 5 years since the anniversary of his death. Some of you on the line will know of him well, some of you will know him by reputation, but many of you in the younger generations won't know Tom. But let me just tell you that he was a most remarkable person. He reached great heights in so many ways, becoming the deputy leader of the federal opposition, holding high ministerial office in the Whitlam and the Hawke governments. But he was so much more than just a noble and highly principled parliamentarian. He had the most magnificent love of people and really spent his whole life working to build a better world. And central to that was his commitment to a world without nuclear weapons. And his commitment in that area really arose in part by virtue of the fact that he was a prisoner of war in Japan, having been on the Burma-Thai Railway. But he was in Japan when the weapon was dropped, second bomb at Nagasaki and the first at Hiroshima. Tom was near Nagasaki and spoke of his recollections of that time throughout his life. But he became a person of great peace and dedicated his life to the eradication of nuclear weapons. So this fund supports ICAN, and I do ask you to give what you can, because ICAN really survives on the smell of the proverbial oily rag. It's a tremendous organisation. A little bit about Helen, because the International Committee of the Red Cross has really been around since almost the middle of the 1800s, being founded initially as a not. When Helen took up her role a few years ago in Geneva, she became the first woman ever to be in that senior leadership group of the ICRC. And she went to Geneva, having worked in Australian Red Cross. She had to become a most proficient French speaker, but she did all that and has held her own and has been a fabulous contributor right at the highest levels of the United Nations, working on behalf of the ICRC and being one of the driving forces in the ICRC for this convention. And she happens to be an Australian, but she's in every sense of the word a global citizen. Our second speaker will be Anthony Albanese, leader of the opposition, patron of the Tom Uren Memorial Fund. I want to say that the person personally responsible, and he will disavow this, but it's true, personally responsible for the ALP taking up a position in support of the signing and ratification of the nuclear ban treaty was Anthony. I won't go into the history of that, how that happened, but let me tell you, and he'll blush and disavow, I don't care, I'm going to say it, took enormous political courage, basically to stand up for a principle, even though, you know, a lot of the colleagues weren't always sharing his commitment. People got behind him. He stood for principle and he prevailed. Well, not only did that, but he prevailed and brought his colleagues along the journey as well. So to have his support and contribution today is terrific. Third speaker, Ambassador Vargas, is an ambassador to Australia from Costa Rica. As many of you know, a beautiful country in Central America. It has many wonderful policies, including some really landmark environmental commitments that are, you know, a lesson for all of us. But Costa Rica played a very important and instrumental role in the negotiating conference for the nuclear ban treaty. And Ambassador Vargas worked with the then UN ambassador from Costa Rica, Elaine Wyatt Gomez, who was chair of that negotiating conference. So those are our three principal speakers. And I'll just quickly say, please keep your microphone on mute. Just a couple of housekeeping things. If you've got some questions, ask those in the chat function. There'll be people there ready to answer and respond. We're being recorded and live streamed on Facebook and on the ICAN Australia page. We may or may not have time for live questions. We'll see how we go. We want to have contributions, but the really important thing, of course, is to hear from our speakers. I want to also acknowledge just at the outset, most importantly, of course, that we meet those of us who are in Australia on Aboriginal land. That's not just a perfunctory acknowledgement, it's a deep, very deep recognition of the importance of the acknowledgement of Aboriginal people at events like this. But when we're talking about nuclear weapons in Australia, you can't do that without recognising the important role that Aboriginal people have played, first of all, in fighting for their rights in the aftermath of the nuclear weapons testing that occurred on Aboriginal land, but also as some of the most outstanding advocates for a nuclear-free world. So with those few words of introduction, Helen, let me give you the floor. A very warm welcome. You've got 10 minutes and thank you.
Well, thank you, Robert. And it is truly a professional, but also, may I say, deeply personal honour to be here and be part of this discussion today. So thank you, Robert, for your eloquent introduction for all of us, putting us in the place of why we're here. And I look forward to engaging. So today, with the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it really is witnessing an historic moment. We have, in waking up this morning, a new global norm which explicitly prohibits the use, the threat of use, the development, the production, the stockpiling and the testing of nuclear weapons, one of the most, if not the most, terrifying and inhumane weapons ever created. Now, this is a powerful message that nuclear weapons are not only morally unacceptable, but clearly illegal under international humanitarian law, which is the law of war. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, warmly congratulates the states, the civil society organisations, in particular ICAN, but other actors, the thousands and thousands of people over so many years, as you rightly acknowledged, Robert, that have brought us to this moment. And the ICRC and our wider Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, in particular Australian Red Cross and the role they played, are very proud to have contributed to this effort. It is a victory on the side of humanity. And I think something that we cannot forget, not only does it prohibit, but this treaty also holds states to account to help victims of nuclear testing and to clear up contaminated areas. So it really is an amazing step forward. Now, this new treaty, it presents us a roadmap to move towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. And what it does is it outlines a vision of true collective security, and one that is really much more viable, more sustainable, and more humane. And it's been part of the journey, I think, that many of us have all been on in the last few years to shift the debate from a political discourse around power and politics towards a focus on the weapon's catastrophic humanitarian consequences. And my belief is the moment we shifted that debate, we actually saw progress in a different way. So whilst we need to today celebrate the entry into force, it's very early in the morning here, so unfortunately I can't start the champagne, but I hope you've all been able to celebrate. So whilst we really need to celebrate this moment, we of course must not forget that the prohibition of nuclear weapons is at the start, not the end, of our efforts, and we need to work towards all states becoming party to this treaty and a range of other things. But I think we need to also take moments on such long journeys to get here to celebrate, get the energy to help us move forward. But I did want to spend just a moment maybe going back into history. We need to look at now and look at the future, but back into history. And just flag that for the ICRC and the Japanese Red Cross particularly, where we witnessed the first-hand unspeakable suffering caused by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, I think it's really important to stand up against sometimes the cynics. I've done a lot of media overnight globally, and of course we rightly need cynics to question whether this is realistic, whether this is something that is going to have a difference. But I think what we need to hold on to is the evidence-based and the lack of realism in thinking that we can move forward and repeat history in the way that we so devastatingly saw. So a few weeks after the attack back in 1945, a delegate of the ICRC arrived in Hiroshima to assess the damage. And what I find always very, very telling, and I've been honoured to see the original in our archives, he sent a telegram back to his colleagues in Tokyo, where he wrote about a chilling picture. He said, "City wiped out, 80% of all hospitals destroyed or seriously damaged." And then he said, "Conditions beyond description, full stop. Effects of the bomb, mysteriously serious, stop." And it's that term, as you could imagine someone standing there, of the mystery. Now today there is no mystery. Today we do not have the luxury of mystery. So the suffering and the devastation witnessed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki led the ICRC to conclude in September 1945 that this weapon, like other inhumane weapons, must never be used again and must completely be prohibited under international law. So it's been a long time coming for us, over 75 years, but it's really, really worth us having this normative change. Now, if we look at once back at history again, in the ensuing decades, unfortunately, the number of nuclear weapons continued to grow. From those two that were detonated in Japan in 1945 to approximately 70,000 weapons during the height of the Cold War, which was around about 1986. Now, today, 75 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are still nearly 14,000 nuclear weapons in the world. And I think one of the things we have to be sober and have actions about is that thousands of these are on high operational readiness, ready to be launched at a moment's notice. And I had a journalist ask me last night, well, we've been safe since, so isn't this treaty irrelevant? When you look at the evidence, and Chatham House has done a superb report on this, we have been lucky. The capacity to have had, a destruction impact on humanity in the last few years due to mistakes, due to lack of communication, and also due to the fact that we increasingly will have cyber issues and digital launch capacities. I think we cannot be complacent that we're anyway, in any form or other, in a safe space. And we know today that even using a fraction of these weapons available would cause mass destruction and over a wide area, and also do irreversible effects on human health, the environment, climate and food production. So everything that life depends upon. So the stakes are very high. We need to look forward to the treaty's first meeting of state parties. And at that time, we've got to continue to push for the treaty's faithful implementation, to intensify our efforts for the broadest possible adherence, and to strive to keep the stories and the testimonies of the Hibasha, those who are evidence of it, who have the experience, in the centre of the debate. We have to be people-centred. So what is sad is that in the last 75 years, our colleagues have continued to treat thousands of patients of cancer and other illnesses, our colleagues in the Japanese Red Cross. So we have to think more broadly than the immediate attack, the impact on the environment, public health, the issues of long-term medical impact. So I think that we also need to highlight that today we are dealing with, obviously, a pandemic, and that has deeply underscored the public health system's fragility in many places, the challenges it faces. And so global solutions for global problems, whether it be issues that don't acknowledge state boundaries, that move beyond, that a few can affect the many, need to constantly be sober reminders of the insurmountable challenges that we face. So I think that it's an historic day, as I mentioned. We look back way into history to see why we've been leading to this point, where so many people have felt so passionate about getting us here. And I think we also just need to reflect in the last few years, say since 2017, where states responded to the overwhelming body of evidence, not only of the harm caused, but also that humanitarian organisations such as the ICRC, such as the UN, would not have the capacity to respond. And I think if you can't respond adequately to something, you have to prevent it. So this new treaty is also part of a wider framework. We need to put it in its place. It's part of a wider framework that obviously includes the Non-Proliferation Treaty and this steps forward our capacity to implement the Non-Proliferation Treaty correctly under Article 6. It's also part of the framework that deals with comprehensive nuclear test ban treaties and regional nuclear-free zone arrangements. So it's an essential building block that moves us forward. So I think what is also important for me to flag is that it has a strong relationship with international humanitarian law. There are key principles that we have all been driving home since these horrific weapons were first used. Principles which underline the basis of this new treaty, the obligations around distinction, to distinguish between civilians and civilian objects and military objectives. How do you do that with a weapon that has the consequences of nuclear weapons? The principles around proportionality and the principles that say you cannot use weapons that cause superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering. So this new treaty adds to the broadening IHL framework, and it's a success in a time of cynicism of whether or not we can move forward norms. But apart from the law, apart from history, I think today is a day about people. And I think it's about bringing the human agency to this important discussion. And I did want to let everyone know that Australian Red Cross is encouraging people everywhere to show their support for a nuclear-free world, and people can be part of this history. They can let their friends and family know that they support a future without these weapons of mass destruction by following the Australian Red Cross on social media or visiting australianredcross.org.au/nukes treaty and find out the 15 practical ways they as individuals can take action for a safer world. So in conclusion, I think we have to take a moment to breathe today. We have to think about, I reflect very heavily, Robert, on the times we visited Hiroshima, the huge personal impact it had on me as an international lawyer when I saw pictures of humans reduced to a stain on a pavement, on bicycles of children that have been mutated. So I think we have to bring a whole human agency to this issue, plus our intellect, plus our persuasion, plus our diplomatic skills. So I think the victory for humanity today and for the future cannot be underestimated. Too many times we have seen dangerous logic expressed of nuclear deterrence and the opportunities for mistakes, which would drag the world into the brink of destruction. This treaty sends a clear signal that nuclear weapons should no longer be part of the international security architecture. And importantly, it allows us to imagine and work towards a world ultimately free from such inhumane weapons and free from the fear of living under the threat of nuclear war. So thank you for the opportunity, Robert, and I look forward to hearing from the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Helen, and I'm glad you didn't reflect too much on Hiroshima because, like you, it's pretty moving stuff. Before calling on Anthony, let me just acknowledge, importantly, Karina Lester, our dear friend and great campaigner from the Maralinga lands, Andrew Giles, MP, Michelle Myers, Sharon Clayton, MP, Tim Ayres, Senator Tim Ayres, and Deirdre Palmer, President of the Uniting Church, who are on the line. There will be others, but I acknowledge those now. And I'm sure you would all want me to acknowledge Christine Logan, Tom's nearest and dearest and soulmate. Christine's been a great support in the setting up of this fund. And yeah, and I know that she misses him terribly, as we all do, as a truly great Australian. I want to now call on Anthony, and I know that Anthony recognises that ICAN is very much not a partisan political player. We're working on this issue. We want the support of the whole Parliament. We've got some support on both sides of the Parliament, but it is true to say that the Greens and the Australian Labor Party have both strong policy positions. They differ in some respects, but broadly, already supportive of this treaty. We want to get everybody on board because, as Helen said, this is not a party political issue. This is a profoundly humanitarian issue, as Anthony knows more than anyone. Anthony, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Robert. And I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, wherever it is in Australia that we meet, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. I acknowledge all of my parliamentary colleagues who've joined me here this evening, and a particular acknowledgement to my friend Christine Logan. Today is a day in which we're gathering just a few days before commemorating the 5th year of Tom's passing on January 26. And the Tom Uren Memorial Fund is an appropriate tribute to Tom. It's something that he would certainly have approved of. ICAN have done quite an extraordinary job. And one of the things that drove Tom in politics was, of course, he believed in being in government. He served as a minister. He was deputy leader of the Labor Party. But he also understood that social change doesn't just come from the top. It comes from the bottom, from movements, social movements. And indeed, in the parts of the ALP socialist objective that Tom was responsible for, speaking about community action and mobilising people in favour of a better world and progressive social change, that is perfectly consistent with what we've seen here. Because the anti-nuclear movement isn't something that's been driven by members of parliament or by governments. It's driven by people, ordinary people around the world who recognise the threat that nuclear weapons pose to security and to the future of humanity. And Tom, of course, experienced this not just in an academic way, but because as a prisoner of war in Amuta, just 80 kilometres across the sea from Nagasaki, he witnessed the second atomic bomb drop. And he said this in his autobiography: "I will never forget it as long as I live. The sky was crimson. We didn't see the mushroom cloud, but we saw the complete discoloration of the sky. We were mystified. We thought that an enormous ammunition dump or something like that had blown up." And he attended an anti-nuclear weapons conference in 1960 in Japan. And when he spoke about that, he spoke about the human cost and witnessing the impact, such as Helen spoke about with her visits to Hiroshima. And he said then that he believed that it was a crime against humanity. He also had such a strong view, and he put that into Parliament when he was elected in 1958. In one of his first speeches, he spoke about stopping nuclear tests. He spoke about problems not being solved by wars, but by peaceful negotiation. And he said in his retirement in 1990, and I had the privilege of working for him, I believe the issue of nuclear disarmament is the most important struggle for the human race. So a very clear position that he had, and I want to congratulate ICAN and all those who've been involved with the coming into effect of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons today. It is, I think, a good week for humanity. I think that the triumph of hope over fear that the election of the Biden administration represents in the United States has made all of us feel just that little bit more secure than we did over recent times. But of course, what we need to do is to continue to work. As Robert has said, we need to make sure that this isn't a partisan issue, that we talk about the impact in terms of nuclear weapons, but there's another impact as well, of course, which is the economic impact at a time when we have such a, I'm just wondering, my computer's doing weird things. Is it still going?
Yes, mine is too.
Okay. At a time when we think about also the incredible economic costs of what's occurred with the amount of expenditure, at a time where so much of the world's population struggle to have enough to eat, to survive, to have appropriate housing as well. There's a whole range of circumstances in which the move towards a more peaceful coexistence across the world is so important. So Australia has, I think also, it's fair to say, played historically a very important role in these issues. We have punched above our weight in previous governments in terms of promoting disarmament, and we should do so again. Labor has incorporated a carefully negotiated commitment that Robert spoke about to a future Labor government taking action. And that is consistent with Labor's values and our long history of advocacy on weapons of mass destruction. Labor had a proud history when other treaties have come into force, such as landmines and other treaties, the use of chemical weapons. Those things haven't just happened, they also have been the product of considerable action. So I think that the important work of ICAN, and I do want to pay tribute, it is quite a remarkable achievement for an organisation essentially made up of volunteers with very few resources to make such inroads into changing public opinion and changing opinions of governments that they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And that should be a source of pride for Australia. The fact is that it's an approach to achieving global change in terms of that bottom-up approach that I'd like to see Australia continue in. It does define a new way of practicing diplomacy, building broad coalitions across an array of state and non-state actors. And that's consistent as well with the role that Tom Uren played during his long period in political life. When he retired from Parliament, he said, I'm getting out of Parliament, not out of politics. He saw politics as being much more than what happens in the House of Representatives or indeed even in the cabinet room. Politics these days as well, including forums like this on Zoom, is a way in which we can interconnect with people, including Helen from across the world here, and engage. And I think that provides enormous opportunities for the forces that are about humanity, that are about respect, that are about ensuring that we have genuine progress in nation states, but also between nation states and across the globe, is able to advance change. So I wish everyone well with your well-deserved celebration that's occurring as a result of the treaty. I acknowledge as well His Excellency in the work that Costa Rica played in particular in it often, I'm not sure if it's an Australian saying or not, you know, herding cats. I know what that's like within the political party that I now have the honour of leading. Certainly on a global stage as well, I know that it's a very significant achievement indeed.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm sure everybody's very grateful for your contribution and for your leadership within the Labor Party on this issue. And on a personal level, I know we all wish you a complete recovery from what must have been an awful car accident. So good on you for being back on deck. Colleagues, I now have the honour of introducing Ambassador Vargas from Costa Rica. In doing so, just let me add one other sentiment before I formally invite him to speak. Anthony importantly raised the idea of the people's movement, you know, the way in which everyday Australians, everyday citizens in the world have played such an important role in generating the energy and commitment that's encouraged governments to create this treaty through the General Assembly and other processes of the United Nations. Let me just say that the next thing we have to do, of course, is to mobilise that same energy, not only of communities, but of governments, to take the next steps in relation to nuclear disarmament. And I know all of us, you know, recognise that the stigmatising and the outlawing of nuclear weapons is a massive step forward for humanity. But we have to go the rest of the journey. And I'm sure that countries like Costa Rica, and I hope one day Australia, will be working closely together, you know, to get real nuclear disarmament, which must happen in our lifetimes. So, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone participating in this event. It's a privilege to have the possibility of talking to an enlightened group of Australians through this activity. And some of you might ask themselves, why is it that Costa Rica is participating? Well, you've mentioned a part of that, but as you well know, ours is a compact country devoted to democracy, peace, work, biodiversity, and happiness, according to a number of international studies, that has incessantly participated in this good cause. It's now a quarter of a century that we have walked and acted together at the UN with movements, organizations, and institutions of the international civil society, promoters of the prohibition of nuclear weapons. In 1997, Costa Rica introduced the first, at that time, draft convention for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And as you mentioned before, Costa Rica chaired the 2017 conference that gave birth to the treaty, a triumph of multilateral diplomacy, undoubtedly. Considered in some respects as a framework arrangement, the treaty can bolster a strong normative effect, stigmatizing and delegitimizing nuclear weapons while actively promoting nuclear disarmament. Global disarmament, we believe, must be achieved through dialogue, negotiation, the effective elimination of arsenals, and the exercise of permanent moral and political pressure from the citizens of the world. As our foreign minister says, in the 21st century, amidst a global socio-economic and sanitary crisis, it is unethical to divert financial resources to the modernization of nuclear arsenals. We must focus our investments in strengthening our healthcare and education systems, in tackling climate change, and in building more peaceful and sustainable societies for all. History has proven that the possession and use of nuclear arms only provides a false sensation of security. I believe that all of us participating today in this event do so as peacemakers. And as such, as peacemakers, we must accept that we are part of the luminous consciousness of humanity. We believe in the moral force of ideas. We reject that might makes right. We are certain that achieving a world free of nuclear weapons is not the sole responsibility of the possessing countries, but of the entire international community. We are convinced that the only guarantee for nuclear weapons not to be used again under any circumstances is their total elimination. And we practice strength through peace, not the other way around, as some would like us to believe. Now, 2021 is the bicentenary of Costa Rica, which 7 decades ago abolished constitutionally its army, its military. Peace is now recognized by law in Costa Rica as a fundamental human right. The manufacture of weapons of war is prohibited. With neutrality as our shield, the state is obliged to promote, defend, and guarantee peace. Just a week ago, Parliament proclaimed Jose Figueres a hero of peace, an Invictus general who disbanded his insurrectional militia and abolished the national army. His leadership set the course towards a culture of peace and understanding for generations to come. It's good that we are celebrating pridefully today, because from tomorrow on, we have tireless work to do. Only 50 out of 195 sovereign states have ratified the treaty. Our treaty, I could say, with ICAN. Costa Rica makes a strong call to the countries possessing nuclear arsenals to build a new security paradigm, one that does not put at risk the very existence of humanity and the planet, but it's compatible with human survival and dignity. And we respectfully call upon those states that have not yet done so to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons without delay. Our humanitarian desire is that its auspicious outcomes benefit all nations as the sun shines and the rain fall on the just and the unjust alike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think you've raised some really important points, and I was going to give a status update of the treaty, and you're right that 51 state parties have ratified the convention. That's, of course, the trigger that the 50 states that bring the convention into legal force and effect. There are 86 countries in total that have signed the treaty. These processes take time, of course. They always have for every treaty. They don't happen overnight. But what we have to do, as the ambassador said, is really mobilize, to get in each country that hasn't yet signed the treaty, get them to sign and then work through that ratification process. But this is what happened with all the other conventions. It's a standard procedure. Changing the world, is serious business. It's hard work for all of us. I wanted to just inject another thought before I pass to Jem Romuld, the director of ICAN in Australia, to say something. But I wanted to just, if I could, share with you a reflection that I've been pondering over today, because I think Anthony and others and Helen talked about, the day, significance of the day and how it stimulated our thinking. It occurred to me that really the commitment that the world has shown to international humanitarian law has been, I think, one of, if not the principal driver to get this treaty created and to come into full force and effect. And it's the same kind of sentiment that drove the treaty that outlawed landmines, chemical weapons, biological weapons, cluster munitions. They've all been stigmatized. They've all been through this kind of process. But, for too long, we've given nuclear weapons a get-out-of-jail-free card. We've kind of simply put it in the too hard basket. Well, this treaty shows that, the power of governments representing the people of the world is able to overcome the resistance to treating nuclear weapons as a special case. It's not a special case. It must be judged by the same international humanitarian law principles that we gauge those other terrible weapons of war that have such an impact on civilian populations. Consider this, if you would. Here in Australia, we've been largely consumed by a debate in recent months, at least in many quarters of the community, around very strong evidence that there were violations of international humanitarian law in Afghanistan that resulted in the deaths of civilians. And quite properly, that has featured hugely in our public debate, and quite correctly. Those violations that have occurred have been condemned by both sides of politics. And that's really important, that Australia is open and transparent and deals strongly with those issues. But consider this, and remember what I said about nuclear weapons for too long getting a get-out-of-jail-free card with international humanitarian law. Almost all the weapons in the world today that are held by the nuclear weapon states are not targeting military targets. They are targeting the largest and most strategic cities of people, of mothers, of fathers, of grandmothers, of sisters and brothers, of children. That is what these nuclear weapons are targeting. And of course, if an attack was launched, it would be the grossest violation of international humanitarian law, you could possibly imagine. Ever more so because of this treaty, which will shape global thinking around the stigmatization of nuclear weapons. But in my opinion, we shouldn't hesitate to start to think really critically about the magnitude of the humanitarian law violation that would occur if a nuclear war started by anyone or was responded to by a nuclear weapon state with nuclear weapons. It would surely be, history would record, a war crime, the greatest violation of humanitarian principles the world has ever known or known since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we should start to really question any country in the world which has a foreign policy and a strategic policy for defence of the country that is literally underpinned by potential war crimes. Now that might seem a challenging thing to say, but it's true. We must really elevate the debate around the stigmatization of nuclear weapons and realise the kind of consequences that would flow, because I think this will, help us move from 70 and 80% public opinion in support of the ratification of the treaty in Australia to an even higher percentage because, the issues are that grave. With those words, let me pass to Jem for your pickup of things we might have missed.
Thank you so much, Robert, and greetings, everybody. I'm joining you from Darkinjung land tonight on this truly historic day. Thanks to all the speakers before me. It's been wonderful to listen to you. You've pretty much said it all, but I'll say some more because it's a joy to speak alongside you. I don't know if it's acceptable serious Zoom etiquette, but I've got some bubbles and I'm celebrating, so cheers. It has been an excellent day. We've seen quite a fuss being made all across this country, and the call raised up really loud and clear for Australia to ratify the ban treaty. And very many of you in this audience have been part of that. So thank you for all your efforts. We've seen First Nations nuclear test survivors speaking up. So a shout out especially to Karina Lester in the audience, councillors, parliamentarians, religious leaders, unionists, lawyers, activists, medicos, and a really broad range of civil society organisations speaking up in support of the treaty today. We saw a 7-metre tall inflatable replica nuclear missile in Sydney this morning. There was a mayor's reception in the Hobart Town Hall. The Medical Association for Prevention of War got their scrubs on and gathered in Federation Square with a very specific call to the Health Minister that nuclear disarmament is a humanitarian and a health imperative. We saw the Treaty Enforcement Squad taking super funds to task in Melbourne over their investments in nuclear arms producing companies. There was a march in the streets of Adelaide, and in Fremantle, I believe right now, a Hiroshima survivor, Mr. Ito, is sharing his story of survival to a room of people, and in a few hours the sun will set there in Freo on a party of band champions. And then tomorrow there'll be a gathering at the Peace Bell in Canberra with Ambassador Vargas also speaking there in person, and the Peace Bell will ring out, and tomorrow night there will be a gathering, an event in Alice Springs and a film screening. So there's a lot happening. We're reaching the end of this historic day here in this country, but we are, of course, still at the beginning of our battle to end nuclear weapons. Today, we see solidified in international law the illegitimacy and the illegality of nuclear weapons. No, the nuclear armed states are not suddenly dropping their nuclear programs, but as time goes by, the ban will become an institution that's harder to ignore. It'll be harder for governments to justify involvement in these weapons. And it will be harder for banks and funds to justify keeping their stocks in the companies that make them. The status quo is not inevitable, and it certainly isn't permanent. So this movement is putting nuclear weapons out in the cold, beyond the pale, off limits. Language matters, and law matters too. This is the new benchmark. It's a clear marker by which we can measure progress towards nuclear disarmament. Before nuclear weapons were prohibited, there was little scrutiny, I would say, of nuclear endorsing states like Australia. Governments claiming a nuclear umbrella could huddle there quietly, but no longer. Australia, as you know, has this contradictory position of claiming to support nuclear disarmament while simultaneously claiming protection from the US nuclear arsenal. Now, this paradox is exposed for what it is, a barrier to disarmament. If Australia truly seeks progress on nuclear disarmament, it will ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We can't sit on the fence forever. So from today, the states parties to the treaty are now bound by its prohibitions and its obligations. There are things they must never do and things that they must do. They must never possess, develop, test, host, or assist or do anything with nuclear weapons. They must maintain their safeguards agreements or enter into one if they haven't already. They must assist victims of nuclear weapons use and testing, and they must take steps to remediate impacted environments. They must urge other countries to join the treaty, so Australia should be expecting some representations. The states parties will come together for their first meeting to be hosted by Austria within 1 year, and they'll discuss the implementation of the treaty and how to take it forward. All nations will be invited to that meeting as observers, so if they are not state parties, and Australia should be at that meeting. As you well know, there are people who don't agree that Australia should join this treaty. There always will be people who don't want this. There are people who think it's not possible to build a non-nuclear alliance with the US. We say we can and we must. There are those who still try to claim that the ban conflicts with the long-standing Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We say that's nonsense. The ban was specifically negotiated to complement the NPT and to further its goals. There are those who say the security environment is not right. Well, I wonder if they would ever consider the security environment to be right, to be stable enough, predictable enough. Australia joining the treaty will not unhinge the planet. The sky will not fall in. We will remove ourselves from complicity with the nuclear problem, thereby signalling our serious intention to end this present and existential threat. Today has been heartening. There's a movement, and today it's clearly visible. It's energizing and it feels good. We have a treaty, we have a Nobel Peace Prize, and now the treaty's in force. So we're pushing and will continue to push, but the current government is on the wrong side of history. So we're delighted that the alternative government, the Australian Labor Party, has a policy to sign and ratify the treaty, which is fantastic. We can't wait to see it happen. We'd love to help make it happen. You know, we're in close contact. And this policy and all of the parliamentarians that support this treaty are backed up by dozens of unions, 3/4 of the public, and a global civil society movement. So going forward, may we heed the warnings of experts that tell us that the risks of nuclear weapons use are growing. As Helen said at the beginning, we have been lucky so far. May we respect the experience of nuclear survivors. They know what nuclear weapons do. They still carry this legacy in their bodies and their land. May we shake down the nuclear weapons establishment. We know it's feeling threatened. And take up the ban, this golden key, to unlock our defeatism and open the door of possibility. We want to use this ban to eliminate nuclear weapons. Our success is not assured, but we're on our way. So I put it to you, let's keep going. Thanks so much for being with this campaign.
Well, thank you, Jem. What beautiful words. Thank you. There are a couple of other things I need to say. They're very important. They build on Jem's. There's some simple messages. I think the first thing is to say that there are people on the non-Labor side of politics who are supporting the convention already. There's a reference in the chat box to Warren Entsch, of course, who's been a supporter of the treaty, and the local federal Labor senator in Cairns, Nita Green, of course, supporting the convention as well. That's a terrific thing. Good on you, Cairns. Both sides of politics. Shows it can be done. Jem has painted a picture of some of the things that need to be done. I just want to echo that and just to reinforce that these things, like getting this treaty and making sure ICAN flies the flag and is able to so effectively continue its lobbying of federal members of parliament, just can't happen unless you give support. And the Tom Uren Fund is critical to getting that support. I think the event of today and the coming into force of the convention is really going to get a lot of people thinking about how short life is and how important it is to leave a footprint. If you want to leave a footprint on this issue, you can do no better than to support the Tom Uren Memorial Fund. There have been donations today of $1,000, individual donations of $1,000, I think more in some cases. Please give what you can. It will not be wasted. Every cent of it is going to go directly on campaigning. Second thing to say is that as ICAN supporters, you also need to be ICAN volunteers. I know there's so many beautiful people on this call. people who can make a real difference. So I want to ask you to redouble your efforts. I intend to in my own modest way, but all of us, you know, have got to take heart from this huge achievement and redouble our commitment and efforts for disarmament and for getting support for the treaty in Australia. And Anthony is right when he talks about the role of civil society, you know, to build a people's movement. You know, we've got great support from churches and faith organisations, support from the trade unions. I've got to say support from the business community isn't as strong as it should be. We need to go there. We need to knock on doors. We need to talk to people that, you know, ethics in business and standing up for a better world is what every business should be doing. And people like, I know Phoebe Wynne-Pope is playing a really noble role in reaching out to the business community on a whole lot of humanitarian issues. We need to get on those doorsteps and in those boardrooms and get them on board as well. But I guess as we move towards our conclusion, let me just say that Tom Uren used to talk about men and women and people of goodwill. And, you know, Anthony will remember he talked about it till, you know, we knew the lines off by heart, but he believed it. And you know what? He was right, because you've got to keep believing in people. You've got to believe in a better world. And the coming into force of this convention and the tremendous coming together of so many people to make it happen shows that we really can make a difference. So thank you, everybody, for your participation in this call, for your support for ICAN, and let's redouble our efforts for a better world and a nuclear-free world that we can pass to the next generation. Thank you, everybody. Have a glass of champagne or water, whatever is best for you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you, Robert.
I don't want to.
Hooray! Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. What a great day. Well, so much more to do, but thank you so much for all the efforts of everyone. It's truly inspirational. You know, we've done so much together, but there's so much more to do to create a better world. And I think that's certainly in line with the aspirations of people like Tom Uren, but for many other people around the world. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Married? Martin. It's still too close, it's okay for it. That's good, yeah. Okay. Yeah, we can leave. Bye.